Hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back. This week we're going to have a very quick lesson tonight. I'm going to be covering maybe four main topics. I got all the drawings ready and fired up here for your enjoyment. So let's hop right into it. We're going to be talking about the lungs. We're going to be talking about how you bring oxygen into the body, how it dissolves in the blood, how it gets spread throughout the tissues, how carbon dioxide is collected and expelled after it's served its purpose. We're going to be talking about a couple of equations that explain all of this, and I'm going to do my best to make it digestible and enjoyable. So we're going to start with this diagram here. Very lovely. And I'm going to explain some of the structures of the lung. This is obviously your right lung, some pressures that go on as air is brought into the lungs, and mechanisms that make a concept called negative pressure ventilation. And so, outside of the lungs, just in the air that we breathe around us, we have the partial pressure of the atmosphere, or just pressure of the atmosphere. And normally at sea level, we're going to say that it's zero. It's just in this neutral state. And we're going to assume that it's not exerting any pressure on us at this present moment. With that in mind, if there is no air getting forced into our mouth and into our lungs via some sort of ventilation machine, there needs to be something that pulls the air in when we inhale. So that's where the concept of negative pressure comes in. What I've drawn here going into the lung is just one single alveolus. You have countless alveoli in your lungs branching off of the primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, and then the smaller bronchioles. But for the sake of simplicity, I just drew one giant alveolus here. And something interesting to understand about a singular alveolus is that it has a ton of surface area. If you are familiar with the florets on a piece of broccoli, how there's just, if you look closely, tons of little tiny buds on it, that's the best way I could illustrate the concept of alveoli. So this is one of those things magnified. And on the inside of these alveoli is little droplets of water. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit later, but something I want you to understand for now is that these tiny droplets of water, this moisture that collects on the inner surface of the alveoli, they adhere to each other and they cohere to this sort of inner membrane. And the collective force that they exert on each other and in contracting the alveoli is called surface tension. It's the same principle that allows little bugs to walk on top of water's surface. So the water itself sort of creates its own contractile membrane, which is important to understand for a little later. So as we are breathing in, we're actually engaging some of our muscles, most notably our diaphragm. As we breathe in, take a deep breath, your diaphragm is going to be pulling down. And I can't really think of any good real life example to illustrate this, but if you've ever had one of those little glass domes with the deflated balloons inside and you pull down on the fake diaphragm, you'll see that the balloons expand. That's exactly what's going on inside of your body. As this thin sheet of your diaphragm gets pulled down by your body, um, automatically it doesn't need to it you don't need to initiate it by using brain power, is what I will say. Your body just automatically knows to contract this diaphragm to pull down and expand this lung to uh, enlarge the space that is inside of it. Now, the lung itself, the membrane immediately on the outside of it is called the visceral pleura, as in visceral or organ, and another layer surrounding the organ, which is really just kind of the inner cavity of your body. The next nearest layer is called the parietal pleura, and these things are very close together. If you can imagine two layers of saran wrap on top of each other, they're practically touching each other at all times. The space in between these layers is called the parietal space, and there are little droplets of liquid allowing them to slide across each other so they don't get stuck together like saran wrap actually would in real life. So in a resting state, the internal pressure of the parietal space is going to be a -3 atmospheres, and that's already a pretty notable difference from what it is outside of the lungs. But as this diaphragm pulls down, that's going to go down to -8. So really, no matter what the case is, even if you aren't expanding your diaphragm very much at all, if you just take a quick sip of air, like a shallow breath, you'll find that you're still able to uh, generate that negative pressure if you just go like that. And that's because there's an ambient internal pressure of -2 in your alveolus. So you pull the diaphragm down, there's -8. That's a pretty strong vacuum pulling air into your lungs. The air, just because the universe is lazy and entropy is a thing, it wants to go from a state of high pressure to low pressure. And -8 is pretty low compared to 0. So it follows that the air from the outside of your mouth or your nose would rush in to fill this big vacuum, just the same as water pours out of a balloon if you poke a hole in it. So, what happens if, heaven forbid, you get a puncture in your lung as you're going about your regular day and breathing normally? Something that I should mention before I get into the punctured lung is that these are ribs right here and your sternum, and these also contribute to the inspiration and exhalation. Your ribs perform a sort of bucket handle motion as you're breathing, and your diaphragm acts as a pump. So uh, it's working in tandem with your diaphragm, you could say. So when you get a puncture in your lung and the negative pressure on the inside is suddenly exposed to the normal pressure of the outside atmosphere, that vacuum is going to get filled in pretty quick. But because it's not coming in through your alveolus, the air is going to kind of crunch all of these things down. You're not going to be able to breathe through your ribs. There's a reason why our bodies weren't designed that way. All this air rushing in through the puncture wound, maybe if you break a rib after a really bad biking accident, all this air is going to come in and collapse these alveolus because these are just, you could probably think of them as like paper bags the size of tennis balls. They're not going to resist this sudden pressure coming in. That's not what they're built for. So your lung is just going to collapse. It's not going to inflate with all this new air coming in. It's actually going to shrivel up. So that was something that I found interesting. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about this substance called surfactant that is excreted by this. little machine on the inside of your alveolus, which is called pneumocyte T2. And surfactant, what it does is, if you remember what I said about surface tension earlier, is it has these little polar heads that kind of alternate between the water molecules, and they maintain a sort of buffer between them, so the water doesn't get carried away and completely cohere into a massive droplet of water. That would also be bad for reasons you can probably know intuitively. You would be drowning just sitting where you are right now if it wasn't for surfactant. It's preventing water in your alveolus. Well, the surface tension is good because it helps your alveoli contract as air is getting expelled back out of your lungs after being used up. You don't want it to get carried away. Like I said, surfactant maintains a happy balance between the surface tension that water provides as a way of helping contract the alveolus, uh, but also not too much so. So a lack of surfactant in this case would impair your ventilation because your your alveoli would just be shriveled up. Simple as that. So something that surface tension becomes even more relevant for is this equation that I'm going to talk about next that falls under a concept called Laplace's law. Now, the simplest way I can put it for you is that Laplace's law is pressure equals 2 times tension divided by the radius. And all that is just a fancy way to measure how much air is being forced out or can be forced out of the alveoli at this present moment. So the tension is referring to surface tension inside of the alveolus. The radius is the size, uh, and this is going to equal the air that can be forced out. So if we increase this denominator, if we increase the size of the alveolus, how do you think that'll affect the pressure or the amount of air that we're able to force out of the alveolus? Well, if you think about it, if you have this massive volume, how easy do you think it's going to be to force more air out? It's it's going to be pretty hard to do. This is illustrated by, like, if we have 100, this is an exaggeration, but we have like a zero point 0.5 tension, 1 out of 100, that's 0.01 pressure out of the alveolus. But what if we flip it? What if we have surface tension as a factor of 50 and we only have a radius of 1 unit, whatever unit that might be, micrometer. If we increase the numerator a ton, then we're going to get some massive number like 100 pressure out of the alveolus. So you can see that surface tension plays a pretty important role in the amount of air that we're able to force out of the alveoli, like I talked about here earlier. The more contractile force that the water inside your alveolus is exerting, the easier it's going to collapse and force that air back out, this pressure out of the alveolus. Next equation that I'm going to talk about to illustrate this a little bit further is called the alveolar gas equation. And this one is kind of a monster, but I'm going to go through it step by step. So here is the pressure in the uh, alveoli of oxygen. So if you think about your breath coming in here through your trachea, past the carina, and all the cartilaginous rings into the bronchi, and finally, eventually into the terminal bronchioles and alveoli. And then you have the fraction of oxygen inspired. So, fraction of oxygen, if I remember right, is going to be around 20% of the air that we breathe. Nitrogen is close to 80%, but it just kind of hangs around and it's not all that important to worry about, is what my professors say, at least, so long as you're not a scuba diver, because pure oxygen will kill you. But that's not what we're concerned with. We're concerned with the fact that our fraction of oxygen inspired is 20% of the air that we breathe. And then you have the atmospheric pressure, presumably at sea level. You have the pressure of H2O, or the partial pressure of water. And then you have the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterioles here. And then this is called the respiratory quotient or ratio. And this is, I believe, carbon dioxide over oxygen. And it usually ends up equaling something around 0.85. So we have a 0.85 here. We have 20% here. We have the partial pressure, which is what we're solving for. This is 760 millimeters per uh, milligram per millimeter of mercury. We have the pressure of H2O and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And this is 47. And I'll have to check what this is, usually 40. Yeah, this is 47-ish. So in a standard state, you will have somewhere around, if we want to do this math real quick, just for fun, you're going to have 20% of that minus 40 divided by zero point 0.8. I don't think there's a calculator tool on here, but for those of you at home who want to find out what your typical partial pressure of oxygen in your own alveoli is, if you're healthy, you can go ahead and pause the video right there. And spoiler alert, it's usually around 102. So the reason why it's important to understand this alveolar gas equation is because it helps us to know what's going on in our lungs, how well all of these gases are being exchanged, and if there's something off, if we have, for example, an extremely high, if we do this whole equation and we find that this is way higher than, or way lower than usual, then there might be some respiratory issues going on, if you couldn't already tell from the symptoms. But this is a good way to uh, kind of check vital signs of breathing and be able to diagnose what someone's problem is based on average ranges. So, uh, this is going to be the last part of the video that we discussed today. I drew it very simplistic, but I'm gonna try to go into it with some detail here. Obviously, oxygen comes into the alveolus. We discussed this, right? And as this little network of capillaries that kind of crisscrosses all inside the lungs here, we have a little gas exchange network that the alveoli are in constant contact with. In fact, they kind of wrap around the alveoli, from what I understand. So on a tiny little cellular level, we have this little baby capillary coming into contact with the alveolus. The fresh oxygen comes in and it binds to the hemoglobin and the erythrocytes, the red blood cells that are passing by through the blood network. And I'm going to grab my charger as I'm explaining this next part. But hemoglobin has this cooperative binding principle. That means its affinity for oxygen increases more as oxygen begins to bind. So after this first O2 molecule reaches the hemoglobin, the heme in its relaxed state, it opens up another subunit that can take in yet another oxygen molecule until the fully burdened hemoglobin, which are several hemoglobin molecules in every red blood cell, but each one can carry 4 molecules of oxygen. Pretty impressive. But what happens if you have this hemoglobin coming back up from, like, let's say a muscle cell in your arm, and your muscles undergoing that cellular respiration, and you have hemoglobin carrying carbon dioxide back up as there's glycolysis and all sorts of metabolic processes going on. You need to get rid of that CO2 somehow, or else bad things will happen, which I'll illustrate over here. But your hemoglobin, yeah, can also carry CO2 just as well as oxygen. And as it reaches this network of the alveolus, it will eventually release, it will diffuse across the membrane, and it will become gaseous again and be expelled right back out through the lungs. As easy as 1 and 2, inhale and exhale. So this little square that I drew inside of our red blood cell here is a, an, a working machine, a protein enzyme sort of deal called carbonic anhydrase that converts uh, H2O and carbon dioxide into bicarbonate and hydrogen, or protons, positively charged hydrogen. So the more CO2 that you have present in your red blood cells, the more protons are going to be produced, and the more your body's going to try to manage that high concentration of carbon dioxide by turning it into bicarb. But you can kind of think of this as a train where it's offloading some old cargo and you're loading on some new cargo, which is the oxygen. And this is the process that all blood goes through, and it cycles through your entire body in like 30 seconds, and it's super impressive. So looking at this from more of a statistical perspective, I'm going to be talking about this shape here called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, and the how it illustrates the affinity for oxygen in hemoglobin. So this is On the y-axis, our saturated hemoglobin, meaning like how much of hemoglobin is at full capacity for oxygen. And this is our partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. So this is a bit of a sigmoidal curve that we see here. It sees its steepest increase as we're reaching around 40 mmHg, I believe. I want to make sure that's right. Yeah, that's at our resting state, which is about 40. And if we look where that lines up on the y-axis, that's about 75% saturation. And we can get close to or even reach 100% hemoglobin saturation, but uh, it's going to take quite a bit of exertion. It plateaus pretty quickly after that point. So, what are some of the factors that might cause us to see a curve that's different from what we normally do? Well, I have here written T and R referring to the tense or taut and relaxed state of hemoglobin. Relaxed meaning it can take up more oxygen, or there's more compliance going on, or on the opposite end, it's more taut and there's more elasticity going on. It becomes a lot harder to take in oxygen in this state. And there are a number of factors that can cause this. I probably won't write them all out with this pen because that takes forever, but I'll just list them off for you. So as we talked about over here, via carbonic anhydrase action, the more CO2 that we have in our blood, in our hemoglobin, the more uh, protons are going to be created, more H plus, therefore more acidity. And that since it correlates directly with the presence of CO2, if we have hemoglobin that's totally burdened by all of this waste product, you can't exactly load new cargo onto the train when it's already full of old stuff. I'll put it that way. So higher H plus, maybe I will write it, higher CO2, more heat. Heat just breeds chaos if you're looking at it from a thermodynamic standpoint. It causes proteins to denature, it causes organic substances to decompose, and it also causes uh, hemoglobin to undergo conformational change to go into this taut or this tense state. And then there was also one more. Yeah, it was 2,3 bisphosphoglycerate. 2,3 bisphosphoglycerate, BPG. Now, this molecule was designed with oxygen in mind specifically because at some point we do want our hemoglobin to reach a taut state. We don't want it to hold on to that oxygen forever. We don't want it to drop it immediately. We don't want it to hold on forever. We want to strike a happy balance. And 2,3 BPG was made for that purpose. So if you spend a lot of time at high altitudes that you're not used to, if you come to Rexburg for the first time, your body is going to start creating more 2,3 bisphosphoglycerate so that the oxygen that you take in, because there is never going to be a shortage of oxygen in your lungs. The surface area of your alveoli is so large that oxygen concentration is never concerned. What's a concern is if your blood is holding onto oxygen for too long and not allowing it to diffuse into your muscles that need it or to your brain as well. and you fall unconscious. So bisphosphoglycerate, simply put, is just the mechanism that allows your blood to dump oxygen into your muscles easier. And so that's why it's good to train in places like Colorado. If you're like on a professional Major League Baseball team and you're going to uh, play a game with another team from Louisiana, you're going to have a huge leg up on them because when you go there down to sea level, you're going to have way, way greater concentration of 2,3-BPG in your blood as you're exercising and you're working hard on the field. The oxygen is going to be dumped into your muscles so much quicker. And so naturally, it would follow that a lack of all of these things, an extremely low gradient, if you're very cold, if you have very low CO2, like if you're hyperventilating, if you have very low protons due to uh, low carbonic anhydrase action, or if you have low 2,3-BPG and you live below sea level, something like that, your uh, hemoglobin saturation is going to fall more on the relaxed side, and uh, it's going to hold on to that oxygen for a much longer time before dumping it into the muscles because your body is telling you that maybe you don't need it as much in this case. So that was pretty much all of the content I had set out to cover this time. So it was a relatively quicker video, and yet it was still around 30 minutes. So I hope you guys enjoyed the little discussion that we had. And if you have any questions, I think I have 4 subscribers at this point. Just go ahead and leave them in the comments if anything wasn't very clear to you. But in any case, I was happy to share a little more of what I learned, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Goodbye.